Hello, I'm Sean Lim, and welcome to After 10. The Eurasian region has emerged as a key economic and diplomatic partner for Korea. On today's After 10, we discuss the era of a new Eurasia and Korea's role as a key ally. Stay with us. Since President Park Geun-hye made strengthening cooperation with the Eurasian nation one of her administration's key strategies, a lively discussion on the era of Eurasia has taken place in both the government and academic worlds. The Global Cooperation in the Era of Eurasia conference was held on October 18th in Seoul. More than 500 participants, including scholars, ambassadors, economic leaders, and members of international organizations, joined the conference and presented their vision to better promote Korea-Eurasia cooperation. John Hemry, President and CEO of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, joined the keynote session of the conference and discussed the importance of promoting cooperation in the Eurasian region. We hear more about the main agenda items discussed at the conference and the expected changes in the international community. So, Mr. Hemry, thank you so much for joining us here tonight on After 10.
Thank you. Pleased to be here.
When we talk about Eurasia, what part of the world are we defining when you say Eurasia? Is it a fixed definition or is it kind of flexible?
There's no fixed definition, but I think it's widely viewed as everything from Turkey to Seoul. You know, it's the grand sweep of the Eurasian continent, anchored really in the farthest part of Asia. Some people call it Eurasia, and they'll put Europe into it, but this is really much more Asians coming together.
So when we talk about Eurasia in the context of what's being focused on right now, it's really the Central Asian countries. Why is that region so hot right now in your sphere?
Let me just step back to draw a larger frame for this. You know, 350 years ago, at the end of the 30 Years' War in Europe, we saw the start of the first truly international system. And it was centered in Europe, it was based on the European empires, and they spread around the world for economic benefit to try to strengthen the home country. That changed the economics in Asia. It took all of the dynamic energy in Asia away from the inner parts of the countries, the hinterland, and it brought it to the coast because all of the trading was at the coastal port cities. So for the last 300 years, Asia has been about the coastline. And then when the Cold War hit, you know, in 1950 with the Korean War, it cut Asia off from Europe. I mean, it just was severed. Now what we're seeing is Asia starting to reconnect inside. This historic geopolitical reality is now being replaced by economics. A little statistic. It takes 45 days for a container to go from the port of Shanghai to Rotterdam. But if it goes on a rail line through Asia, it takes 14 days. This economics is transforming the region. And now what we have are governments trying to figure out what does it mean and how do we make this a good thing for everyone.
So when different governments around the world are trying to reconnect Asia, are there any sources of conflict there?
There's a lot of tension. It is, as you said, Central Asia plays this enormously important role. Central Asia, most of the countries that are now we call Central Asian republics were at one time part of the Soviet Union. Historically, before the Russian Empire, they were in various degrees vassal states to China. So this is a region that's had two historical imperial traditions, a Chinese imperial tradition and a Russian imperial tradition. And we still see these two countries, you know, struggling, you know, to be the dominant power in Central Asia. The Central Asian governments are a little nervous about that. You know, they're looking for their own future, but they have two big neighbors. And so this is the geopolitical dynamic, very complicated.
And so Turkey also is apparently trying to get its presence there too.
Turkey has a very dynamic government these days, a government where they've harnessed all of the powers of the government for economic advancement of the country. And Turkey is trying very much to extend its influence throughout the Central Asian region. So if you were to say, where are most of the conferences going on about the Eurasian reality, they're in Turkey. Turkey is promoting the idea because they see themselves at the very center of it.
So if you could perhaps give us a brief example, what would it look like if it was a Chinese-dominated region or a Russian-dominated region, Turkish-dominated region? What's so valuable about linking the Central Asian region to one's own economic bloc?
Oil and gas. And if you look historically, all of the pipelines, there's a lot of oil and gas in the Central Asian republics, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, lots of oil and gas, and all the pipelines were going through Russia. China wants the energy to come to China. So there's been a real competition over building pipelines. Frankly, some people would like to take the energy down to India. There's a huge booming market in India. So this region became dynamic and somewhat contested. Really, it started over the oil and gas industry. Now it's starting to grow in a much larger way. People are realizing if they build out large rail infrastructure so that you can do direct shipping to Europe from China, it dramatically cuts down on transit time. So all of a sudden there's a huge interest in building massive projects, railroad, road, pipeline projects, build out aviation routes, etc. This is becoming a very dynamic region for economic reasons.
And here we are in Korea, all the way to the to the east, past to China. But you recently attended a major international conference sponsored by a government think tank about Korea and Korea's role in the whole Eurasian context. How do you think Korea could actually play a role when there's so many larger powers at bay?
Well, I thought it was interesting that the government held the conference and that President Park has put impetus to this idea. I think it's actually quite interesting. First, the Central Asian republics don't want to be captured by any one of their neighbors. I mean, they want to be independent states. Where do they go for expertise? Where do they go for counsel? Where do they get technical support? Where do they get business investment? Korea could be a major source of that. So it's, in one sense, it's a real opportunity for Korea. And I think Korea is trying to chart fundamental relationships, understanding this geopolitical dynamic in the region.
So you also participated in a panel there. What was the main topic of discussion?
Well, it was an interesting panel, but I think if there was one central theme, it's that this is a region that historically has not had strong governance. And that's the challenge going forward. I mean, in general, most of the problems in the world today are horizontal and all the governments are vertical. When you have an issue like transit routes that crosses 13 time zones and goes across 6 different countries, how do you cooperate to make that efficient for everybody? It's an interesting and tough problem. So we spent a fair amount of time talking about this question. How are we going to organize the system so that countries feel sovereign control, but they get the efficiencies of the modern international era?
So what is the main thing that could be focused on right now in order to move this partnership forward?
Well, first there needs to be a fair amount of capacity building throughout the region. There needs to be more transparency. For example, there's a lot of talk about customs unions, but there really needs to be far more transparency. And a customs union that only deals with 3 or 4 countries and attaching it to Russia probably isn't the right answer. There needs to be customs harmonization throughout the region. But again, it's this rivalry. There's a rivalry going on between Russia and China over who gets to dominate this region. All of the countries are looking to have their own space in this, and Korea wants to play a role, and that's probably a good thing.
So if all of these countries are trying to get together to cooperate, does that mean there's enough for everybody? Is it worth everybody to cooperate, or is it worth people, countries trying to gain the upper hand?
The Chinese are very fond of talking about win-win situations. I think that's right. My experience has been political people they always define the world as winning and losing. Business people define the world as winning and winning. Business people don't mind competition. They just want to win their share, and a little bit more than their share. But they're not trying to defeat the other side. The business mentality is one of mutual benefit. And I think that's really the opportunity here. I don't think that there's a geopolitical solution to this, but I think there are economic solutions to this. And pursuing those economic solutions would be a good thing.
We're talking about this region that goes from the borders of Europe all the way to Asia, largely totally excludes North America and the United States. But from your perspective as an American, what stake does the United States have in this discussion?
Well, we are not a neighbor to the Central Asian republics. We're interested, however, that these countries they develop, that they not be a source of instability, that there is prosperity that goes down to their populations. We would like to see their economies get integrated into the international system, and we'd like to see this all evolve in a manner that's consistent with transparent international norms. So I think our role is to encourage the Central Asian countries to do what's in their best interest. Helping them realize what's in their best interest is to cooperate and embrace some larger international standards of transparency, high standards of governance. That'll be good for them, it'll be good for the world.
Well, speaking of security, North and South Korea, the relations have been up and down this year. We've talked about in the past of having a gas pipeline go through Central Asia, go through North Korea to South Korea. Where do you think future developments of Eurasian cooperation could have an effect on that project?
Well, I think there's a very positive and constructive relationship between Korea and Russia. Russia, for it to retain its sovereign control in the Far East, needs to develop the natural resources in the Far East. And they need capital and they need technical expertise to do that. Korea and Japan are by far the two best countries to do that. Their economies match actually quite well. They have tremendous capital formation capacity. They have great organizational skills, technical skills. It would be very good for Korea and Japan to start working with Russia to develop those resources, bring them to the international market. But it raises the question, what about North Korea? I mean, North Korea is a very troublesome problem. Running a pipeline through North Korea makes a lot of Americans nervous. We have to find ways for North Korea to change. I think that's part of Korea's strategy, is to try to find a pathway for North Korea to develop economically. Running a pipeline through it may be, I haven't studied it well enough, but I'm completely in support of finding ways for Russia and Korea, Russia and Japan to be working economically together. That makes a lot of sense.
Do you think there's a way to get North Korea on board with this economic future with Eurasia that might help in that regard?
It's hard to predict what North Korea would ever do because it's not clear that they have a rational decision-making structure inside. This is a regime where, because they'll kill you if you don't agree with the supreme leader. everybody just says, yeah, whatever you think, I agree with that. That's the most brilliant thing I've ever heard. I mean, so it's that kind of yes men kind of a mentality. And so until the ruling clique comes to its senses and realize there's no future through intimidation, there's only a future if they were to stop trying to intimidate the rest of the world and start to become a normal country. If they were to do that, then I think they would see there could be a role for them to play. But right now, South Korea is such a powerhouse, and because of the North Korean, you're a seafaring nation. You're going to be doing the commerce of Korea overseas. Eventually, you may join this this reconnecting of Asia. But right now, North Korea is in the way.
And speaking of reconnecting Asia, there's a lot of efforts right now just to reconnect Northeast Asia, China, Korea, Japan, through some sort of economic partnership and even a political structure. How do you see the future of just the Northeast Asian region in terms of getting along?
Well, it's pretty tense right now. There is quite a bit of tension between China and Japan, of course, over the Senkaku Islands. And there's a lot of tension between Korea and Japan over the history issues. There's tension between Japan and Korea as well, but in recent months, it has been better because China is trying to play a more helpful role with North Korea. But this region has got a lot of stress in it. And it's difficult for us because Korea and Japan are both very important allies to us. It's very difficult when there's a lot of tension between them.
So, from your extensive experience in Washington, how do you manage the relations when, if you have Japan and Korea not getting along with each other, but you have such strong bilateral relations with each country?
Well, it is to engage both countries with a serious discussion about their own national interests. I mean, the history issues are very important. I don't minimize it one bit. The history issues are very important. But it's also, we just have to look to underlying national interests at this time, which are really very important. And overwhelmingly, Korea and Japan have far more in common with each other and far more to benefit from working with each other in their core national interests. We do have to find a way to deal with the history issues. I don't minimize it one bit, but I think the way we talk to them is say, look, we also have to deal with just fundamental core national security interests. And it's in your interest to work together and for us to let us work with you.
Well, speaking of national interests, Korea has been going out on many diplomatic campaigns to link up with the ASEAN region or even bilateral partnerships that are away from the U.S. alliance. Does that concern the U.S. at all?
No, I think it's good. I mean, look, Korea is, it's the 9th largest economy in the world now. It's a dynamic society. It should be playing a larger role. It shouldn't be playing some little minor role as a young stepbrother to the United States. Those days are done. Korea should be standing and should be taking a lead internationally. I think Korea does need to take a larger role and needs to see itself taking a larger role in the international system. So no, we're not at all worried to have Korea take a larger role, and sometimes it'll be with a different view than ours. That's okay.
So in terms of this Eurasian community, what do you think Korea could contribute to this process in terms of taking a leadership role?
I think, there was a very interesting study done 7 or 8 years ago by the World Bank. And it was a study that tried to answer the question, what's the cause of wealth of nations? And they tried to evaluate the cause of wealth based on 3 things: natural resources, mineral resources, energy resources, fisheries, etc. Human resources, human-made resources, that is factories and rail lines and this sort of thing, man-made infrastructure. And the third they called intangible resources. And intangible resources were things like the quality of an education system, rule of law, the sense of common purpose in society, a sense of fairness in society, and a stable currency, a predictable judicial environment. When you think about it, and the analysis showed that overwhelmingly, probably 3-to-1, the cause of wealth was from these intangible resources. And if you think about it, all of them are the product of good government. Good governments create wealth. Bad governments destroy wealth. Well, this is a region that is very much in need of good governance. And I think this is something that Korea can champion. This is something Korea can take to the world. Help these countries see what does it take to create functioning, responsive economic systems where there's predictability, rule of law, transparency, all of these values. This could be very much an important thing that Korea could do.
Well, over in Central Asia, what do you think needs to end over there?
Well, look, there's an enormously bright future, I think. There's a huge population in Western China and through Central Asia that has not been really allowed to compete in the international marketplace. There have got to be brilliant scientists, there have to be brilliant artists, there have to be creative businessmen throughout this region that have not had a chance, have not had an opportunity to blossom. And I think that's really in the future. I will live long enough to see it, I believe, that we're going to see this region become very dynamic, very constructive, much like Korea in many ways. They won't succeed the way Koreans work so hard, you know. But they can do well if we can give them a better governing structure. And especially if the Central Asian republics can find a way to cooperate with each other. I think there's a wonderful future, and it would be good for all of us. I mean, we're all better when there are fewer poor people in the world, you know. And so, finding a way for Eurasia, for the Asian landmass to develop its creativity and its economy, this would be good for us.
And you think they could maintain their sovereignty?
They can. I mean, but like every place, you know, we have to adapt to these challenges of an international era. I mean, if you think, you know, the capacity to move money, ideas, people around the world is unprecedented. The movement of things, bad things also move very rapidly. So we need competent governments. We don't want weak governments around the world. We want strong governments around the world. But then they have to find ways in which they can work together, because as I mentioned earlier, all of the complex problems in the world are horizontal, but all the governments are vertical. And so we have to find ways for governments to cooperate, and this is an opportunity. Governments need leaders, and in this sense, I think this was the purpose of our conference, was for Korea to say it's willing to play a leadership role, and we're trying to find the best way for that to happen.
Well, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights on this very interesting topic.
Thanks for inviting me.
And that does it for us tonight on After 10. Join us again soon. We'll see you next time.